it may well be great next week, or vice versa, honestly. So we'll see who emerges triumphant in this Sultai ramp mirror between Yuma Yamamoto and Ari Lax. And you see the need for the Sultai decks to recognize the prevalence of Goblins and Godfarer's Gift and Rakdos, Pyromancer, and so on. Lots of cards like Languish for Yamamoto, Extinction Event for Ari Lax, which are not going to find many uses in the mirror here.
And Languish is a loud declaration, right? That is one where you say, I do not care if the creatures get exiled. I just want all the medium and smaller creatures to go away. It looks like Ari prioritizing land drops, which we can gather based on his hesitation with a hand that has Uro, it has Pulse, it has Aether Gust, all these cards that have play here, but just putting your lands on the battlefield is so important.
Yeah, and look, Ari sends it back. Rewarded with perhaps a much stronger hand in the mirror. 4 lands, Uro into Nissa as a curve with Ugin as a top end. And we actually see Ugin get put back here on the Mulligan 6. A reflection of just how important those land drops are.
And this is a sign where we see that Uro with this Nissa who shakes the world in Ari's hand. Ari wants this Nissa on 4.
And Thoughtseize for Yamamoto, a nice start there.
Sort of.
Currently, yeah, no Black Source on this turn, and Yamamoto also keen to make land drops too. So, Thoughtseize at least does something, but it's not clear if it's better than just your basic forest would be in this spot.
And, if we're being honest, early Thoughtseizes are not something you need to be placing a premium on these matchups. You're going to see a lot of turn 3, turn 4 Thoughtseizes in game 1s of these mirrors because you want to take the most impactful card possible before it comes down. So Nissa who shakes the world, for example, it doesn't matter if you take it on turn 1 or 2, you're just giving Ari some time to plan around to not having a Nissa. But if you wait a couple turns, then Ari might end up scrying differently, mulliganing differently, or even sequencing his lands differently if he knows that there's not a Nissa there.
And in Ari's hand, you see Pattern Negation, a curious addition to Historic via Jumpstart, or Amonkhet Remastered, where it's never really doing anything good for a format, right? It's only allowing the player who's already ahead to press that advantage, or defending some absurdly degenerate combo deck, which probably should not exist in the first place. But in this deck, it's a great way to stick the Nissa and guarantee that your opponent can't answer that and then follow up with their own Nissa, let's say. Or, against Goblins, you can play your big threat and not just die on the spot to a Muxus.
Yeah. Pact of Negation with Nissa just creates this sort of dynamic where for a turn, you definitely get to untap with your Nissa, but you basically only have 5 mana the following turn.
And so an interesting choice here for Yamamoto with this Thoughtseize. I imagine Nissa is the default, and we do see that go. Ari does not have that second green source yet, though. So there is an argument for maybe taking something else and trying to strand that in his hand, but with what Yamamoto has going on, which is frankly not that much, I think you can't afford to let that Nissa stay.
Right, this is a situation where this game is going to go a few more turns, and you can't just play a game where you hope Ari never draws a green land. It's just not realistic in the slightest.
And Shard Typhoon, maybe we'll see cycled main phase here just to dig for additional land drops.
It's a little tough, but there's nothing else really going on that's that attractive. So hitting, say, a tapped green source here, or just like a Zagoth Triome would be great to do it at sorcery speed for.
Yeah, we're getting enough fuel to escape that Uro, but our land situation is not enabling that whatsoever here. 2 swamps on board for Yamamoto.
I believe dire is a good way to put it.
There's that second green source for Ari Lax, but no immediate payoff for that.
Oh,
although he also has
Uro. Maelstrom Pulse on Sharks
on the wings. Not his intended target in this mirror match, I think, or really anywhere else at all. But hey, definitely could get the job done.
Maelstrom Pulse, Maelstrom Pulse. Look, I appreciate it. Sometimes you just got to put a joke in the dirt.
This is interesting, though, because Yamamoto could quite conceivably have a Nissa of their own to follow up with. So Ari, if he uses the pulse on the shark tokens. Are you then priced into pacting a follow-up play?
I think pacting a Nissa is just fine in a lot of ways, right? There's a point where you're just not that stressed if you trade it for a Nissa anyway, especially when you see that Yamamoto is choked on mana.
And Ari may decide that Hydroic just ruling the skies, being bigger than either of those sharks, means no need to fire off the Maelstrom Pulse quite yet. Or is this going to be a smaller, a baby Hydroic?
Do.
So I guess just looking to trade with the shark, keep the cards flowing, and then set up Uro with pattern negation backup?
Yeah, it feels like that's kind of the play that Lax is going for here. It's just trying to pave the way for one threat to take over the game by itself. And the more you reduce Yamamoto's resources on the battlefield, the more likely it is that you actually get to snowball some sort of advantage that way.
And finally, Yamamoto finds the 5th land, the 2nd resource, in a Zagoth Triome. It does have the Eliminate to swat the Hydroic out of the way. I'm not sure if there is... there's not something like Narset Paravails in quite the same way in Historic, but Uro, I think, is a good reason to hold that for another time.
Yeah, there's certainly a point where here we see Yamamoto making the decision, do I want to have a 2/2 Shark or an Eliminate?
And there's Thought Erasure being a good backup to Thoughtseize there. Seeing 2 copies of Nizu Who Shakes the World, so we can't strand that entirely. But just taking the Eliminate to clear the path for the Uro. I like this.
Ooh, and especially with the Pact in hand, which is face up, right? Yamamoto knows it's coming, but how do you play around a 0-mana card like that without just playing into it?
And with Uro on the battlefield, Nissa is not even that impressive. If you're having to throw your lands in front of Uro to protect Nissa, then you're not actually getting much more in terms of mana generation.
Right, and there's even a point where Ari might just let a Nissa resolve, attack it in, to which Yamamoto has to chump block, and then pulse the Nissa.
Yeah, you get to eat the land essentially for free.
Maybe
or the shark token, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we would see a chump with the shark, but that's still just it's just turning pulse into a 2-for-1.
The other thing, too, is Extinction Event also accomplishes the same task, removes both blockers at once by calling even.
Oh.
And then we get to save the Maelstrom Pulse for something more important.
Yeah, and you can feel Lax just saying, okay, how wrong can this go?
So I think the endgame here for Yamamoto is if they can find another Thoughtseize to clear the pattern negation out of the way and then stick the Ugin. That seems like the most likely route to recovery here.
Yeah, the fact that Yamamoto's going to be losing this swamp is so brutal.
Yeah, I don't think I like this attack with that in mind. I'd much rather force Ari to either use a removal spell on the shark. Turns out he has a removal spell that just hits everything. But I don't want to lose a land, especially if there's a chance I also lose my Nissa afterwards.
What we in the biz refer to as the dream.
So here is Extinction Event on even, giving Uro a clean shot at Nissa, which Ari does decide to take.
Uro being just big enough to kill a Nissa who rolled up.
Okay. Oh, alright, so there's Extinction Event, which does force Ari's hand potentially on this pattern negation.
Oh, but Uro could have... Okay.
Yeah, how about our own Uro? That plays too.
Yeah, Maelstrom Pulse would blow up both of them if Ari pulled that trigger.
And that's a hilarious dynamic here, yeah. And so now, is this worth a pattern negation? Ari decides yes, he wants to keep pressing his advantage with his own Uro, get those attacks in, put a clock on Yamamoto.
I imagine the point here is that Nissa just isn't actually that threatening.
And so here's second Maelstrom Pulse, and a land. So now, the coast is clear for Extinction Event, and then Ari has nothing left immediately, and Yamamoto has 2 follow-up Nissas and an Ugin. So are we seeing a turnaround in this game, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Just Ari pulling the trigger on Pact on that copy of Uro it makes sense in a vacuum, but it looks like it might come back to bite him here. Ari just flooding out a bit here, has drawn, I believe, 6 more lands than Yamamoto this game.
And Maelstrom Pulse only hits non-land permanent, so even if Ari gets into a desperate spot where he would like to target land, he can't do that. He has to find other ways to contain those. So Breeding Pool crunches in for 3. We'll get to cast the Growth Spiral at the end of Ari's turn, thanks to Nissa. Has to do it now. In response to Maelstrom Pulse, finds his own pattern negation. So now, that lets Yamamoto defend the second Nissa, if that's on the docket. Or actually, yeah, why not? Defend this one right now. Turns out Ari will get to use the second Pulse, and that also means that second Nissa is delayed by a turn.
Yeah, that's actually a really big deal here.
So not the worst exchange for Ari, who now has a window where if he draws, let's say, another Uro or a Nissa of his own, there are a lot of draws here for Ari that swing the game back in his favor.
It feels like a really big turn to just kind of take that kind of risk, but Lax...
look at that. A nice, meaty Hydro Crisis for... Yamamoto has got to be frustrated seeing all those lands getting tapped here.
Oh yeah, this is certainly the spot where you just go, are you serious?
Now I think Ari, maybe the mana can works out for this perfectly. He would love to draw Thoughtseize and have that to clear the way here.
That would be huge, being able to knock out that Uro.
A nice new fresh hand of cards. Mostly lands though with a second Uro, so that Ugin now still threatens to be the best thing going on in this game.
The fact that Ugin's minus doesn't take out Nissa lands is just something else.
I thought we were going to be free from that dynamic in Standard after rotation, but luckily, I say, living on in older formats.
Luckily.
And think how different this immediate situation would be if Yamamoto had that Swampland play, which turns out, again, Extinction Event got it all. But this is the kind of spot where you're building towards that endgame. You really want to have that land over that 2/2 Shark token.
Absolutely.
And so now I think we get to... Do we cast Nissa and escape Uro this turn?
It's close. I mean, I imagine so.
I could see an argument that you would rather hit the Ugin naturally, deal with the crisis, and then the Nissa won't just immediately get attacked down on the battlefield, but maybe you have to force the issue there anyway.
Yeah, this feels like a spot where we might just see Yamamoto saying that after Ari drew so many cards, they're just assuming that Ari is going to be able to check at least one card, and this is almost like the bait Planeswalker. All right, well, there's that 8th land.
And there's the...
16th.
16th, yes, for Ari Lax.
Or no, 17th, excuse me, because another land came down last turn. 18.
And this is where you really wish you could pick up those Zagoth Triumphs somehow and get a redraw or something that actually contributes to this game.
Oh yeah, you just look at your Zagoth Triumph and you just go... Little did I know.
This is where in paper 2, you crack your Fable Passage, you check the top card of the deck to see exactly what would have happened, and can only ever feel worse about it.
Oh, I see you've never just picked a land up off the top of your library with a fetch land before.
But that's a stylish way to do it, for sure. Oh, wow.
There's Thoughtseize off the top for Lax.
That is, after a drought of good draws, that is the perfect draw here. And so Yamamoto's entire game plan just crumbled in an instant.
This 10/10 Crisis just rules the battlefield now.
Well, there's another Nissa. Is that the 4th for Yamamoto here?
I believe that is the 4th Nissa.
So that plays somewhat, but you see the meaningful difference here between Language and Extinction Event, where if that were an Extinction Event, Yamamoto would happily trade off those breeding pools for that 10-10 Hydro Crisis. As it is, I don't think that language is getting cast in this game. Oh, but Eliminate sure is. But this now is another interesting spot. Where do we want to stop the Uros from trading if Ari's inclined towards that, or do we want to just tag the Crisis? And I think Yamamoto decides we want to tag the Crisis.
Yeah, that's the way that you can actually snowball an advantage with this Nissa who shakes the world, right? You can try and get out ahead on the battlefield by eliminating this Crisis, and then just blocking down Ari's copy of Uro.
Absolutely, and Yamamoto could even threaten to put a bunch of lands in the way of the Uro 2 trade-off, or decide, I actually don't want that Uro maybe escaping again, finding more cards for Ari, so I'm happy to just, let one of these swamps take one for the team and play it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just a perfectly defensible way to play this here, is just basically trade off lands for a couple of turns while applying pressure with your own Uro and creeping closer and closer to that Nissa ultimate.
And Ari finds Nissa alongside an Eliminate, so if this is a double block, this ends badly. So single block is fine, triple block is fine. Decides just to sacrifice the swamp.
There's also a level of this where if Yamamoto rolls this Nissa up to 7 next turn, it can just take a hit from an Uro.
Yeah, for sure. And that might be the way that language becomes relevant in this game, is if there's a disparity between who has more 3/3 lands, and Yamamoto can regain the initiative by sweeping all the 3/3 lands away, and then animating his own with Nissa. This has been a really back and forth game.
Yeah, this is one where it has felt like at multiple times that one player was so favored. And Ari realizing that he has so many lands on the battlefield, he just doesn't even need to develop Nissa yet. Don't let Yamamoto play around it, or even attack it down next turn.
A new Uro being cycled for Yamamoto. Finds the 8th, 9th land of the game compared to Ari's high double digits. We're kind of getting into the 20s. We're at that point where if you put the number in your article, you have to just write it as a number instead of a word. Like that's where Ari is creeping towards here.
Oh yeah, it's nice. He's going from I drew 2/0 lands to I drew 21 lands.
Nice inside look at the star guide there for all of you listening at home. And Ari showing some amount of discipline with his Eliminate, not preventing the Uro attack there. But if that's going to lead to a post-combat Uro just being escaped anyway, then that makes a lot of sense. Okay, and here's Harness Act, which, again, can do double duty, either removing an Uro for a turn, or, I guess, removing 3 counters from a land to get that one off the board.
What I think we might end up seeing here from Lax is Lax just trying to sculpt his entire game plan around getting to activate this Nissa multiple times.
Triumph is cycled, picks up a Fetid Pulse, which also gets cycled. Finding a Thoughtseize.
Woof.
And so now a land and Uro come at Nissa. Ari picks up another Uro, which he could cast and escape that one right now too, and still have far too much mana left over. And so yeah, now with that Nissa on 7, it can in theory take a hit from Uro. We don't have to attempt a somewhat risky double or triple block.
The big thing that's worthy of note here is this just restricts Yamamoto's ability to ever plan on ulting a Nissa this game.
Yeah, the Nissa ultimate is it's easy to overlook when you get into these back and forth situations, but it is a real thing that can happen when these games go so long.
Right, and just having a pile of indestructible lands is very relevant.
So 1 land down. 2 more lands trade off. Nissa falls to 1. Ari gets to cycle another Nissa. On another Uro, sorry.
I wasn't going to say it.
And yeah, I think Ari sees some use to just escaping the other Uro now, swapping them around, effectively giving his vigilance, trying to find some more action and not the 19th, 20th land of the game.
He's at 18.
He's actually at 22 now, if you if we can solve the top there. Do you think Yamamoto feels ahead in this game? I kind of wonder. I wonder what the kind of internal monologue of both players is here.
Honestly, I imagine both players are just hoping to find a Hydroid Crisis, and then the game immediately ends.
Yeah, we see 2 Crises for Yamamoto, 3 Crises for Ari Lax. Both players, I think, have already gone through at least one. And this is where we saw some of the Sultai decks in Standard playing a card like Castle Vantress or Castle Lockthwain, just for these situations where both players are kind of flooding out, the game is somewhat at parity, and you just want to dig for those big game-ending haymakers.
Right, just finding a way to literally close the door is so important.
Yamamoto experiencing some amount of flood now.
Got to make up for the deficit in lands at some point.
And for all of the twists and turns this game has taken, it feels like the most likely ending is, oh, it was turn 16, we both had a billion mana, and I drew Hydro Crisis, or I drew, Shark Typhoon, Ugin the Spirit Dragon. You could easily reduce the game to that, but I think that would remove a lot of the nuance that you've seen through this game so far.
Ooh. And we're starting to hit the point where Lax has, with this Extinction event that he's casting, has just dealt with so many of Yamamoto's lands.
Yeah, that's the play that I mentioned with the language that could come up, and we're seeing that kind of in reverse for Ari Lax with the Extinction event now.
And this means that Nissa's gonna die.
Yeah, that Nissa is dead, no matter what.
Oh, this is so brutal. This feels like the point where Lax is gonna start running away with things.
Just yet another Uro for Yamamoto. And if Yamamoto still had an Uro, that would be fine. You can afford to spend 3 mana on your, Growth Spiral, Revitalize, Fuse card. But as it is, that's eating up a lot of Yamamoto's turn. Thoughts he's just naps a redundant Nissa.
Gotta feel good about that, though.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not necessarily the best use of exactly this turn, but of all the cards for your Thoughtseize to tag on turn 100, you can't feel bad about the most important one.
And there's Eliminate, which I wouldn't say even qualifies as a good draw for Ari compared to other stuff still in his deck, but does once again just swat away an Uro, force a lot of mana and cards to be spent bringing it back.
Turning off Uro attacking for a turn is colossal. Especially since here that Languish represented Nissa dying.
Yes. I guess Eliminate would stop that for the time being, but yeah, Ari decides you can cycle an Uro again, you can have, you have quads, that's fine, I don't care. There are certainly some amount of diminishing returns on drawing so many copies of that card.
Right, this is the spot where Uros are just going to start eating each other.
You see Yamamoto maybe motioning to concede for a second. He'll play on, he'll put up a fight.
All the cards in this deck are so powerful that when it feels like they can just win on their own, you might as well go through the motions, And
Yamamoto has finally seen enough here. So game 1, after a real back and forth, goes to Ari Lax. And this is where, at home, you slump into your Carnox gaming chair with Relief, which you can buy over at carnox.com/SCG, saving 10% at checkout using that discount code.
And I think that first game was really just defined by Lax having plans on a long-term scale for how he wanted his cards to line up against Yamamoto's. It felt like the Nissa's, all the reactive spells and so on, had a specific place that they were going to get used, and it was not always just what was the most profitable thing to do in a single turn cycle.
Looking at the sideboarding, yeah, here we have a stack full of Nissas and a stack full of negates for both players. So is it just swapping those in for some of the dead removal, or are there some other layers to that?
I imagine most of what we're going to see here is just lower on things that hit creatures, higher on things that hit planeswalkers, because they are the more important cards in the matchup. We also see these Narsets as a check for specifically the card Hydroid Krasis and Uro. Those are the big things.
Narset also helps to find those other big haymakers like Nissa, like Ugin at the top end. So definitely a matchup refining card, which is kind of like this prison piece and this combo piece at the same time. Listen,
aren't you just so excited about the monocolor half Leovold, half dig through time? The combination Leovold dig through time?
An innocuous, uncommon planeswalker that gets restricted in Vintage? Yeah, sure, why not?
Yeah, no big deal. Don't make it weird. There's that. There's Mental Misstep, Ponder. It happens all the time.
And this is a really interesting call here for Ari Lax. What would be your first inclination to put back?
Probably a second negate. It depends what you think the pacing of the game is going to be, right? We see Ari reaching for this copy of Nissa, which just says that, in Ari's opinion, the first few turns of this game are just going to be sort of draw-go, and hitting land drops is more important than having this big 5-mana sorcery.
And this does somewhat insulate him from Thoughtseize, where if Yamamoto is looking to use that Thoughtseize to clear the path for, let's say, a Narset or some other non-creature threat, then, if Ari has one negate, then that can happen. If Ari has two negates, it's suddenly a much tougher question.
Yeah, this is the spot where giving yourself a pair of the strongest card in your deck is just naturally going to insulate you from a lot of the interaction that the opponent is bringing to the table. See, and here we even see Yamamoto going after Uro instead, which has got to feel like a win if you're in Ari's seat.
I think Ari honestly loves to see it.
Yeah, because now Yamamoto has to go through these negates the hard way.
And you see Ari, your inclination might be, okay, I'll put that Overgrown Tomb onto the battlefield tapped, but that gives away information. That shows what you drew. Ari knows that there's likely no need to shock that in the next few turns, so why not just conceal that information and pass your mana up?
Right, just not letting Yamamoto plan around what cards you have access to does have some amount of value, and if playing the tapped Overgrown Tomb doesn't, that 2 life is just kind of left over anyway. Just sequence things a little bit differently than you would kind of normally think to.
Ari snaps off negate on that Cultivate. Is that an intriguing decision still?
Just look at last game and look how much mana dictated the pace of things. How different Hydroid Krasis was and the sizing of Shark Typhoon was based on mana available. Lands are one of the only things you can't interact with unless Nissa comes down. And if you're already planning to turn off Nissa, then trying to deny the number of lands that Yamamoto has access to is just completely intuitive.
And Thoughtseize forces Ari's hand on that second negate. So the coast now potentially clear for a top decked Nissa, Narset, anything in that category.
Narset in particular would be a great pickup for Lax here.
And Shield's now up with Pattern Negation. Oh, and Ari is the one who picks up Narset. Speak of the devil.
And with this forest in hand, Yamamoto likely just... forest face up in Lax's hand with the Nissa. It wouldn't surprise me if Yamamoto feels priced into just letting that resolve.
Yeah, I mean, what if that Narset finds a Nissa and now you're in the same spot except your opponent has a Narset on the battlefield?
Right.
So that makes a lot of sense, but Ari does have the Nissa in hand anyway to punish. Finds a 5th hand and finds the second Nissa to back it up.
So that means the Narset would have found a second Nissa. Ooh, that's a
Ooh.
nice pickup.
Yeah, negate able to defend the Uro. Now, Ari can stick his own Uro, which negate cannot counter.
Right. When one of the things about Uro is in a lot of ways it being escaped feels almost like a double-edged sword. And what I mean by that is that whenever you're playing these interactive Uro mirrors, is a lot of your cards are actually just exchanging for your opponent's cardboard, right? Negate puts a card in your opponent's graveyard, just like it does yours. Same with Thoughtseize. So if your opponent, or if you get to escape your Uro, you can pretty much assume your opponent is very close to escaping theirs. Luckily, Yamamoto having a cycle land earlier in the game, I think put him a little bit ahead in that race.
It's that classic dynamic of there was a class of cards that were called the Titans after Primeval Titan, not Uro Titan of Nature's Wrath, but that whole cycle where they put the opponent in the spot where they had to remove it. You had to use your Doomblade or your Sweeper effect. But if you did, you still didn't feel great because you were 1 or 2 cards behind at least. And Uro is just the epitome of that, where you can remove it once and it's still probably coming back. It's not like they even have to find the second Grave Titan or anything like that.
Right, this is a spot where that card can just come back over and over and over.
It's a little bit of an awkward mana situation for Ari, who... Yeah, currently...
Whoa!
Well, this is bold.
Cute! Attacking with 2 islands, so if Yamamoto doesn't take this, then Lax's Uro just comes back.
Yeah, I like that. This gets the 5th card there for escape, and so this is either a 3/6 damage, or it's dueling Uros now.
Please, my friend, can I transform my land into an Uro?
Oh, wow, okay.
But Lax's plan was to go Nissa into Uro, which gets punished by the negate from Yamamoto.
That's brutal. And now Yamamoto just gets everything. And that Overrun Tomb is actually a great draw because now Ugin's coming down too.
Oh my god. Ugin can just bolt the Nissa.
You've heard of bolting the bird. Well, let me tell you.
Nissa's a big bird.
What a swing on that turn. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. Things just coming together for Yamamoto, but I mean, that's kind of the thing that Yamamoto was playing for. That's why we saw Yamamoto prioritize developing this Uro onto the battlefield before.
Yeah, Ari solved the puzzle of how to actually successfully cast Uro on that turn, and put his chips in the middle, and Yamamoto had the time to negate to punish him.
Oh, jeez. Oh, this is an uncastable Pact of Negation.
Oh, it sure is.
Because if Ari casts it, then Yamamoto can simply bolt Ari's second blue source. And Ari will lose. Not until Ari's next upkeep, admittedly.
So Yamamoto gets a send in with Uro, finds a second copy. And now there's no even concern that the card Ari drew might be negate or something, because, as you mentioned, all that blue mana is accounted for. So Yamamoto gets to free to go for Nissa. And Ari knows what the deal is.
This is a nightmare scenario if you're in Lax's position.
And usually, if you're facing off against one Nissa or one Ugin, there are theoretical outs that you can draw towards to get back in the game. When there's both at the same time, oh, and by the way, there's an added Uro as well, I don't know what Ari... If Ari's deck was configured perfectly at this point, I don't know what he could draw to get back in this.
Right, Maelstrom Pulse at this point does not do it, and that normally is Lax's most powerful answer. Oh, tell me he's gonna do the cute thing. Keep the Uro that's about to die so you can minus Ugin to deal with Lax's other Uro.
Oh, that's nice.
Absolutely, it is what we see from Yamamoto. Really knows their way around an Ugin here.
And yeah, Ari will pack it in. We'll send this one to a game 3 between these two Sultai ramp experts. Crucially, we see Aethergust languishing in the sideboard there for Ari Lax. It's easy to default to thinking, well, my opponent has Nissa, my opponent has green cards in their deck, therefore Aethergust might be good. That's often not really how these matchups play out, especially when cards like Thoughtseize are such a big component of it.
Right. In formats like Standard, where you have Casualties of War, for example, Aethergust is generally going to be a much more positive swing in terms of mana, turn development, and so on. But when all you can really hit is Nissa, you just don't feel very good about it, right? Because hitting the backside of an Uro, for example, is a big swing, sure, but basically you're discarding a card to make your opponent exile 5 cards from their graveyard and spend some mana, and that's just rancid, especially since they just get to draw an extra card with the Uro the following turn. And after that, what are you doing? Hitting Hydroid Krasis?
It's weird to say that Uro kind of isn't what the games are about necessarily, because we saw Uro, like dueling Uros on both sides of the battlefield, really help to define those games. But if players are going over the top with Nissa and Ugin and Hydroid Krasis and all these other cards, sometimes a Narset just blanks an Uro by itself, it's still a fantastic Magic card that is one of the best cards in every format it's in, but it's not the focal point of the matchup the way that it is in basically every other matchup.
Right, you see both players shocking a bunch, which kind of implies that they don't worry very much about their life totals, especially when they're playing Thoughtseize and the like. So if attacking for 6 over and over and over just isn't relevant, then all you're really hoping that Uro is going to do is be a Phyrexian arena for you.
Yeah, and a really unfortunate pair of mulligans there for Yamamoto, putting him down on resources to begin the game, putting back at least one copy of Nissa.
Imagine the line here is between Nissa and Thoughtseize specifically, because when you're lower on resources, trading, say, your 5th resource for your opponent's 7th resource is not actually that great of an exchange.
Yeah, there's a good argument for keeping a Nissa, I think, because that is how you overcome that resource deficit, is to stick an early Nissa that Ari can't immediately deal with.
Right, and the other side of things, and I think what Yamamoto is thinking here, is just that you actually need some time to just develop resources and reach the point where you can have Nissa take over the game, whereas in a spot where you don't have a ton of interactive spells, say just some lands, an Uro, and a Nissa, that's a spot where you can fall very far behind to an opponent who's on the play and is loaded up on negates and possibly Aethergust.
And Ari has a lot of good tools, but doesn't really have the lands to fully exploit them with. And you saw that choice on this turn. Do I want to hold up Negate? Do I want to cast Thoughtseize? Do I want to maybe develop the Fable Passage as a tap land? So here's Close Spiral in response to Thoughtseize, finding the 4th land, crucially, for Ari.
And you can see Thoughtseize and Negate are both just cards that are interacting with what the opponent is doing and trading for a good card. So Ari Lax is just thinking, if Negate or Thoughtseize is just going to trade with a good card anyway, this kind of taxes Yamamoto's Thoughtseize in a way, or it just makes it to where this Thoughtseize isn't actually getting a very good exchange here because it isn't tagging something like a Nissa.
And a tough choice for Yamamoto. Decides to take the Thoughtseize, which is interesting. Placing a high priority on not getting Thoughtseize himself. But as we mentioned, I think the easiest route back into the game is to stick a top deck Narset, stick a Nissa or something, which would be immune from Thoughtseize, but does walk into the negate.
It feels like the difference here is that Yamamoto is just trying to gain virtual card advantage in the interim. Look at Yamamoto's hand. There's Uro, there's lands, but there's nothing that Negate can interact with. And taking several draw steps, letting the game develop in such a way where Negate isn't as impactful as it would be, is easier to do than blinking something like Thoughtseize, where Ari Lax gets to cast it on his terms rather than on yours. And Negate is the kind of card where you have to sort of opt into it having text.
I wonder if Yamamoto doesn't take the Thoughtseize, if that's a sign for Ari that he doesn't need to Thoughtseize just yet.
Right, there's a point where if you leave your opponent with Thoughtseize there, Ari might just wait a turn or two and try to use it to force through something like a Negate, but it's more likely that Yamamoto's copies of Negate are powerful if you take the Thoughtseize.
And there's Thought Rage of Ari, who, if that was a Thoughtseize, he could play that and hold up negate. Now there's kind of an interesting choice.
Ooh, and we see the clock on Yamamoto's side might actually come back to bite them for playing out all of that first game.
And here's Uro, hoping finally to find some action. Okay, Narset qualifies. That one plays.
Yeah, Narset's not bad at all.
There's a face-up negate that we have to fight through, but maybe we just have to jam because, something's getting negated in all likelihood. And I don't know if we have time to wait for a Thoughtseize. But
right.
Yamamoto decides maybe pass the turn and cycle a land instead, and now gets punished by the Thought Rager.
I'm not actually positive this is a punish. I think this is a spot where Yamamoto is instead really leaning into these copies of Uro and trying to blank that negate by saying, I think my opponent's going to do something about this Narset. Let's cycle this land, get this Uro on the table as fast as possible.
And Ari may be looking to get his own Uro on the battlefield as soon as possible in return.
Right,
and
this
there
copy
it
of
is.
Thought Erasure is so good at just getting you halfway there for Uro by itself.
Yamamoto cycling now to save time. He understands that he's under a little bit of time pressure. Oh, and there's pattern negation. So now, shields are well and truly up. We have two ways to defend this Uro, or to stop Ari from forcing through and resolving some other play.
Right, having negate plus pact is a great way to bridge the gap a little bit and try to pave the way for just some big planeswalker to take over.
Ari can now attempt a gigantic Hydro Crisis. I mean, I've seen larger, but it's still pretty big. What do you make of this trade by Yamamoto?
I think this is a spot where Yamamoto is just trying to clear the battlefield, right? You just want to actually create a spot where you slam this Nissa, win a counter fight, and win the game from there.
So the hope would be, I suppose, that Ari plays a big thing you can negate, and then you kind of trade off resources, you can escape an Uro as a follow-up, but Hydro Crisis really putting a damper on that plan. And yeah, Yamamoto concedes.
And that was just a spot where